All right, see ya. Hey, Seth, thanks for coming on.
Hey, can you see me or just hear me?
No, I can see you and hear you.
Okay. Are you doing video too, or is it just being audio recorded?
I think it's just being audio recorded, though. Can you see me?
Okay. Mm-hmm.
Okay, so yeah, so I guess we'll start right now.
Okay.
So, to the average fan, last year's Seahawks season sort of made sense for, I guess, for four reasons. Number one, Russell Wilson gets hurt in week 1 and 3. That kind of derails a lot of their progress. Number two, the offensive line goes to crap, for lack of a better word. For the running back, they're planning to replace Marshawn Lynch with Thomas Rawls and CJ Procise. Both of those guys get hurt. And then number four, Earl Thomas gets hurt, and their whole defense goes to shreds. To the average fan, that explains the season, why they kind of dropped off. And then you come out with this article that goes into their internal issues, which the details and the information in there was fascinating. But to you, what really stood out in that story?
Um, well, first, thanks for having me on. And I think that the thing that interested me from the beginning and the entire point of the story was to try to explain why this star defensive back, a Hall of Famer in his prime, an iconic player in that city, was on the trading block, and why the team was so open about shipping him or being open to shipping him. And I found that really fascinating. And, you know, there was nobody, I remember seeing a couple things where people thought that maybe, I was like a chosen reporter that people chose to plant information with or something. And I've been doing this for a long time. I would never be used like that. I was working alone, and it was my idea, and it was a lot of it was a long process of a lot of phone calls and meetings over weeks, and asking people 4 or 5 times to meet with me, and then calling them back 4 or 5 times after the fact to make sure that I had what they said accurate. And that was the point of the story, was just to try to explain the dynamic of why Richard Sherman was ever on the trading block.
Yeah, it makes sense. And going in, a lot of people had probably you as a writer had a perception of Sherman or perception of the Seahawks. They're a very polarizing team. Did your perception of them change after you did all the research and the phone calls, or did more or less line up?
No, I liked them all. I loved Richard Sherman as a player and as a voice for a long time. I love Pete Carroll's coaching style. I love the way that Russell Wilson plays. I had nothing against the Seahawks, and I think
No,
that
I wasn't.
yeah, the thing that I grew up in Alaska, so all we got were Seahawks games growing up. So I remember the Dave Craig days, and I think that the thing that I think that surprised me in the course of reporting was just you know the culture there. And I think that we knew about it, obviously, but I think that learning about the sort of way that they allow their players to be themselves, and sort of the positives and the at times consequences of that, I think, is the thing that I found the most interesting. I talked to players who were there and have left, and they were when they signed with Seattle as a free agent, they were always surprised about how ruthless that locker room can be at
Yeah.
times. And I think that to me surprised me the most. I mean, the example, of course, is you go back to the night before the Super Bowl that they played Denver, and there was that fist fight between receivers. And, the Seahawks considered a sign of team unity that news of the fight didn't get out. Not that the fight took place, but the news of it didn't get out. And I found that really interesting.
Yeah, we're with Seth Wickersham of ESPN, the magazine, right now, and talking about kind of the article. And I guess some fans would think this is old news, but people keep reacting to the story. Sherman was on ESPN with Josina Anderson this week, and Russell Wilson's commented to a local reporter about kind of his relationship with Richard Sherman and kind of how it's, I think the word they used was professional. How have you responded to some of the response you've got? I know Michael Bennett came out and kind of tried to deny the story, and some of the players have tried to come out and maybe change the narrative that came out. How would you respond to that?
Well, it's okay. I mean, they're allowed to respond as they want. And, I've been doing this for a long time, and I've worked on stories that, were trending towards controversial. And, I know how this goes. Like, I know how, a lot of players that I talk to would come out and deny things, and that's okay. Like, I get it, because that's sort of, the team dynamic that you have to have in the NFL. And, I would never, I don't like to speak to sources anonymously as a first resort, but sometimes you have to, because there's a code of silence in the NFL. And,
Yeah.
Even on a team like Seattle, where guys are, allowed to speak their mind about issues, and it's very different than, their peers in Boston.
Definitely.
You're talking about some incredibly touchy situations that, needed to, they could only speak honestly about if their anonymity was guaranteed. And, I don't just take one person's word for it. I, took a couple trips out to Seattle, and I had a lot of phone calls, and, I fact checked and cross checked, and, Sherman knew the entire time what I was working on. And, I that was my reporting process on the story, and it was something that I took very seriously. And so I'm comfortable with what I wrote, and I wouldn't have written it otherwise. And, there's a lot of people on the team who have reached out to me since then, with encouraging text messages and reassurance that what I got was right. Even people who wouldn't talk to me for the story have actually reached out to me since the story came out.
Okay, that's pretty fascinating, because I remember when some of like the backlash from Bennett came out. I think you tweeted that you had a lot of reassurances from people around the organization. So is that more
Mm-hmm.
players or people in the front office, or is that something you're comfortable talking about?
Oh, I would never, name names or even hint at it, but I appreciate the question. But it was a response that I got that was universal, really. I mean, there really wasn't like a person who reached out to me who I worked with on the story who was said, no, 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 well, you mischaracterized what I said, or this
Sure.
wasn't it, you didn't nail it. There wasn't anybody like that. I was, like I said, the process of putting a story like that together, I mean, I'm driving people crazy, calling them and touching base again and trying to make sure that, what I have represents what they said.
Yeah. And the amazing thing about that story, I found not only just the details you had in there, it was just you could send that story to six different people, and six different people would have completely different takes on that. That says a lot about kind of depth that was in that story. And I was on the Twitter the other day, and I noticed a colleague of yours, and the ESPN writer from Arizona, described Seattle as the definition of dysfunction. And I think that came out of that story. And would you agree with that characterization? And if not, how would you describe this group?
No, I mean, that's how they function, though. Like, I think that, like, when there's people in New England or with other teams that are kind of more, they want to control their players more, that I think that they would see that as a dysfunctional situation. And that was something I was very careful about in the story, was trying to not judge it. I think that I weighed in certain moments of the story, but I really tried to explain that, living on the edge is how they're built to live. And that's how Pete coaches them. And there's a theory behind it, even when it blows up like it did towards the end of last season, when Richard kind of went off the rails and, was openly defiant of play calling and coaches, and openly defiant of Pete Carroll's suggestion that he was going to be contrite for doing so. And so, I tried to, again, I go back to the culture question, and Seattle's got an incredibly unique culture, and it's reflective of Pete Carroll as a head coach. And remember, when he came back to the NFL, the thing he said was that, everybody asked, what have you learned since you were with the Jets or with the Patriots, and since your last trip in the NFL? And he said, I learned to coach within my own personality. And,
Sure.
this is a reflection of how he coaches and how he has, built an entire philosophy that's been incredibly successful.
Yeah, one of the obviously Sherman was a dominant character in the story, but the reaction that for me that really got me was kind of how the team views Russell and how they've responded to him since the Super Bowl. And last year was a very unique year for Russell. He had those 2 injuries right away, and he was going through some crazy treatments to go through the season. And did his perception change at all in the locker room? Did you get a sense of that, or was it more still a reflection of this is the buttoned-up guy who kind of doesn't really give you a bit of his personality, kind of is more of a fan of the management than one of the players? And did that change at all, or is it more or less the same as how he's regarded?
Well, I think that it's different for each guy, and obviously, like, the issues with Russell, I think that a lot of players find him disconnected from the rest of the team. Yeah. But I think that, like, at the end of the day, and I really try, and let's face it, a lot of this stuff is pretty petty. And, it's about his personality, and it's about, there's one player who, like, Russell gives every player tickets on Alaska Airlines as a present. And, there's one player who's like, well, big deal. He has an endorsement with them. And, so I tried to sort of show that a lot of this stuff isn't necessarily rational. I think that, like, the biggest deal is that, you have a historically great defense that thought they would have multiple Super Bowls by now. And I think it's really difficult for a lot of the players on defense to hold themselves to that standard. And, the offense, I think they scored 13 or fewer points in 5 games last year. And that's a sizable percentage. Injuries, everything going on, that's a lot. And I think that since Russell Wilson's been the starting quarterback, I think that only 3 out of the 5 years they've been in the top 10 in scoring offense. And that's difficult, especially when, that defense was put together in such a unique way. And I tried to show that in the article too, is that a lot of this is that, like, they had this brotherhood and they thought that they were going to go down listed with the Steel Curtain and the 85 Bears and all these other great defenses, and they still might. But, to have that destiny and that dynasty thwarted at the 1-yard line is really difficult. And I think that it frustrates a lot of players when the offense barely scores and, Russell sort of speaks in these platitudes about how they made a lot of great plays and they just need to get better when, he did that after they played the Rams and they scored 3 points in that game. And I think that's really frustrating, especially when they feel like that Russell isn't held to the same standard that they are.
And so, I can't help but wonder now, like, how do you move forward from this? And say Russell comes out and he's had trouble with Green Bay in the past, and that's their opening game. If he comes out and puts up a stinker in the first game, is this something that you can see resurfacing, or is this something that, like, how do you move forward from something like this?
I think privately it will. I don't think it may not play out publicly. I think that, like, people ask, like, what's going to be the impact of this story? I mean, Pete Carroll's been coaching for 43 years. I mean, he's been through a lot of stories. I don't think he cared about this thing at all. And I think that he handled it very well. I mean, he didn't undermine the story in any way, shape, or form. He called it old news. He tried to explain his culture, and that's okay. And I don't blame him for doing that one bit. And, I think that after that, they move on. That's one of the amazing things about the NFL is that, like, each day you're presented with things to do and you have to do them no matter what's going on outside the field. Now, I think that if the offense struggles again this year, I think that privately, of course, it's going to be the same old story with a lot of the defensive players and some of the offensive players. But, will it spill out publicly? I mean, I tend to think that, like, that probably won't unless it gets really, really bad.
Sure. And you mentioned Pete Carroll before, and he's such a polarizing figure among football fans. People who don't really know his backstory have pretty strong opinions on him running up and down the sidelines and kind of how he handles his players. And kind of at the end of the story, there was kind of like a Carroll did it again, happy ending kind of feel. So kind of what's your perception of him, and what do you expect from him from this group that kind of still has some similar questions where they don't have a great offensive line and they're still, it looks like a defensive heavy team that they're going to win with trying to run the ball? Like, how do you view him going forward, and kind of what do you see Richard coming out of the season, because he's nearing the end of his contract and they looked at trading him. So what do you see in his future?
Yeah. So, when the story came out, G. Scott, the local radio host, who's a great radio host and friends with a lot of players, he talked to a bunch of people and he said, look, this story, nobody disputes this story. But the thing they were saying was that, like, it isn't us now. And that's what I was
Yeah.
trying to get at with that part of the story, you know, and even the ending of the story was that, you know, this is a family, you know, no matter how dysfunctional it may or may not be or look from the outside, this is a family. And, you know, Pete, I think, lives in the moment. And I think he felt like that since Richard had come back and their offseason program had started, you know, everybody was acting like nothing happened. And he was, you know, going hard in practice, and he was encouraging the guys who might be there to replace him one day, or at least replace other people in that secondary one day. And, you know, that was his focus. And so that's why I made a point of giving that a lot of breathing room, because, you know, it was showing that, you know, it's spring now, and, you know, these guys are trying to move on, and we'll just see what happens. Like, you know, it's easy to do that, you know, in spring, and it's easy to do that in training camp. And, you know, that's, you know, every player will tell you the same thing. And then, you know, but once the season starts, you know, it's interesting to see the emotional fragility of a team and how it rises and falls. And, you know, that's what Pete is so good at, is letting these guys sort of, you know, be themselves, and getting them to be convinced that if they can be themselves and their best self, that, you know, the team will kind of become its best self. And so, you know, where do I see this team going? It's a really difficult question. But, you know, that is a historic defense, and there is no question that the window for that group of guys, as they were constructed, is shrinking. You know, their drafts say it all. And, you know, so that's going to be the most interesting thing for me this season, is because I do think that there is that sense of urgency from this team. And you're right, there are a lot of the same questions that there were last year.
Yeah, and I've read books on like kind of how the Cowboys were in the '90s and all the kind of the craziness of their culture. How rare is a culture like this in the NFL from all the years you've covered it, or is this kind of just a boys will be boys kind of thing, or is Pete's culture that unique compared to the rest of the teams you've covered or been around?
I think it's pretty unique. I think that there's teams that are close to it, like Denver, for instance. You know, I think that that's a team that, not only from the way that it's constructed, but from a personality standpoint, you know, they kind of don't sweat these little personal disagreements or blow-ups that much. But, you know, look, Pete is a fantastically successful coach, both in college and in the pros, and he's, you know, two decisions having gone differently, from probably being in the College Football Hall of Fame and the Pro Football Hall of Fame. And
Yeah.
of course he's got a unique system, because, you know, it's his system, and it's survived, you know, coaches coming and going, and players coming and going. And what I think is so unique, though, about Seattle is just the way that defense was put together. And,
Yeah.
you know, the fact that so many of them were, you know, draftees or free agent signings that weren't, that, you know, that were overlooked. And the fact that these guys all became so good almost so fast, I think, is so fascinating. And that's what made, again, that loss to the Patriots harder, I think, to get over. And, you know, those losses stick with people. And when I was on TV talking about this story, I was on NFL Live, and Teddy Bruschi was next to me. And as he was talking about the Patriots loss to the Giants in the 2007 Super Bowl that cost them an undefeated season, I mean, you know, his face changed, and you could see sort of the pain of that loss coming back. And, you know, that's what makes these guys such great athletes, is how they take so many of these things and are able to, you know, internalize them and play as if something greater than their self-worth is at stake. And so that's why I think that, you know, for this group of guys that pride themselves on not just being a great defense, but being a historically great defense, if not the best ever, that's one of the reasons why I think this stuff is so hard to move past.
And there was a lot of guys dealing with injuries at that time too. Sherman had the arm. Cam Chancellor was hurt. He's playing through, I think, an MCL sprain, and Earl had a bad shoulder. So I understand how deep that burned to go through what they threw and come up 1 yard short.
And they lost players. Yeah, and they lost players during.
Yeah, Cliff Averill and Jeremy Lane. And another part of the story that he wasn't really mentioned big in the story, and I've always kind of been fascinated by his role, is John Schneider. He's the GM, and did you kind of get a sense for his role in the organization and how he kind of fits into all this, or were you more focused on the player side?
Well, he's in charge of their personnel. I'm not sure that Pete is that interested in, the personnel side of it. I think that, like, obviously when it comes to draft day, he's very engaged. But, that's, John Schneider, he comes from that great Green Bay background, and, that's his baby. And, he's one of the guys that found, him and Scott McLuhan and a lot of the other, people that they've had that have been kind of rated since then, they were the ones who put the nucleus of this team together. And so I think that I don't know what John, what his focus is during the season other than trying to help these guys win. I think that, like, once the season starts, I think that, this is the players and the coaches more than anybody. They're the ones who sort of like are the focal point, and they're the ones who try to deal with these issues as they come up. I don't know. I honestly don't know, like, what his role was with all of this Richard Sherman stuff, other than,
Sure.
he was like Pete out there commenting about, the fact that, Richard, they were open to talks about him with teams.
Yeah, it was so unique and it was so rare. And yeah, I think that I covered everything pretty well. And thanks, Seth, for coming on. That was incredible. And hopefully your story isn't the dominant point of conversation all season. But with that team, you never know. You never know what's going to happen. So again, I appreciate you coming on. That was great stuff. Great insight.
Thanks a lot, man. I appreciate it.
All right. Have a good one.
All right, man. You too.
All right.
You got to bring yourself up to the screen. You got to broadcast yourself if you want to. If I can hear you, if you want me to hear you. Nice. I see it. Let me stop recording. Hold on.